Welcome to Money Matters. I'm Emily Johnson, Certified Financial Planner and Managing Director of Polaris Capital Advisors. And today I'm going to be joined in a little while by Michael Howell, who is an estate planning specialist here in Hilton Head, to talk a little bit about, or a lot about, special needs planning, which is a very timely topic. And we'll be interested to talk with him in just a few minutes. Before we get to Michael, however, I want to address a few of the things that are going on market-wise. We certainly have plenty of news to talk about again this week. We're filming this on a Tuesday. That's, of course, following one of the most volatile weeks that we have had, or volatile week and a half, that we have had in the last several years. More volatile, actually, than following September 11th, more volatile than 2008. So definitely a lot of interesting things going on. Today, as we speak, Merkel and Sarkozy, who are the leaders of Germany and France, are meeting over in, I believe, in France to discuss the emerging European debt crisis and what can be done with that. Because they're actually meeting, because they're taking action, and because they came back from vacation to discuss these issues, there is somewhat of a calming effect on the markets. The panic factor is going down somewhat. What will come from that meeting is still unknown, but the fact that they're taking action is creating more of a calming effect on the markets in general. As a result, the VIX index, that volatility index that we talked about last week, also called the fear index, is subsiding. It's going down. In fact, right now it's down about 20 to 25% from where it was. So the fact that Europe is taking some action is actually having a calming effect on the markets. We've also seen some softer earnings forecasts coming out of several companies. That's following Ben Bernanke's comments last week, where he's expecting a prolonged, not so much a recession, but a prolonged soft GDP and a prolonged soft earnings and revenues for the government. As a result, we have seen, and that's also been driving to some degree the market declines that we've seen, and that could be somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As we see slowing GDP, we see some slower consumer sentiment, therefore they don't spend money, therefore corporate earnings go down, and we see the market go down further. So, hopefully this will start to subside little by little, and we also have seen one shining light, and that is that today we had Home Depot come out with their earnings, and those were actually stronger than expected, and they also had very strong forecasted earnings going forward. That's an interesting trend when you consider who Home Depot is and who they serve. You might actually consider the fact that consumers by and large now are going to be deleveraging, spending less, and therefore looking at their home perhaps as a place to live as opposed to an investment and spending more money on their home. That's an interesting trend that we're going to be looking at. And one last thing I want to mention, and this actually goes back to David Kroll, who is usually on the show. He made an interesting comment to me last week, and that is that they've been very busy, not so much because interest rates have been low, but because people in uncertain times really want to control what they can control. And that means controlling their spending, controlling their budgets, and one element of that is controlling their mortgage outflow. So for those individuals that are able to refinance, they've really been diving into that refinancing opportunity. One, because the interest rates are low, but really more importantly, so that they get that confidence around their home and the cost of their shelter. So I thought that was really interesting, that people are striving to take control of the things that they can control in an uncertain market. And I thought that was an interesting comment that he had. So that's also a good segue into what we're going to be discussing with Michael Howell here in just a minute, and that is taking control of estate planning, specifically in the area of special needs planning. So if you will be so kind to join me back in just a few minutes, we will be back with Michael Howell to discuss special needs planning. I'm Emily Johnson, and this is Money Matters. Welcome back to Money Matters. I'm Emily Johnson. As a segue from our last segment, where we were talking about taking control of the things that we can control in uncertain markets, I'd like to talk a little bit about estate planning, and specifically estate planning for individuals and families with children or siblings with special needs. I'm joined right now by Michael Howell. He's a specialist in estate planning located here in Hilton Head, South Carolina. And Specifically, special needs is of interest right now, I think, and it's gaining a lot of heightened awareness as autism has been gaining a lot of heightened awareness, and the various elements of the autism spectrum, not just developmental disabilities, but also physical disabilities, etc. They're all in that special needs realm. So planning for individuals with disabilities, I know, is very different from planning for just children and and families in general. One tool that I'm aware of is Special Needs Trust, and that's designed, my understanding, is to protect the assets of that individual with special needs so that they're still eligible for state and federal benefits. So can you tell me a little bit about Special Needs Trusts and the various elements of planning for individuals with special needs?
I can. It's important to go back to the client and what their needs are. Normally we get involved in these on Hilton Head where the clients come in, usually a husband and wife, usually retired, and you're doing their planning for them, you're dealing with the tax implications, you're trying to make sure they're taken care of in the event of disability, you're trying to make sure that upon their death the assets are transferred smoothly to the beneficiaries. And hopefully before you finish the planning, all of a sudden you find out that there's a child or a grandchild out there, and usually it's an adult child, by the way, with our clients here on Hilton Head who has some sort of very serious disability. Can be mental, can be physical. And it's the kind of disability which entitles them to Medicaid. It could entitle them to supplemental security income. And in those cases, we have to be a lot more careful because the question comes down to if we just leave them the assets, well, then that would disqualify from receiving
And
supplemental
what is the
security
amount,
income.
and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but what is the amount that disqualifies them? Is it, I know it used to be $2,000 that was the maximum amount of assets that could be in that child's name. Is that?
That's basically a Medicaid rule.
Okay.
But there's also supplemental security income, which is the tail that wags the dog, because the trusts are more controlled by the Social Security Administration in their program's operation manual called their POMS.
Now, that's the federal level or is that at the state level?
Technically, that's at the federal level. If you qualify for supplemental security income, you virtually always qualify for Medicaid. So you design your trust to qualify for the Social Security POMS.
Okay.
And basically, you're careful to make sure that you don't pay for things like food and shelter. Now,
Really?
Right. It's the food and shelter that you have to be careful of, because if you pay for that, then what it does is it reduces the SSI benefits and can ultimately disqualify them from Medicaid.
Now, who's going to be paying? Who are the players in a special needs trust?
Well, the players in the special needs trust, as far as the couple that comes in with the adult child, is obviously the clients and the child. The clients would set up a trust, maybe post-mortem, which is designed to take the assets that may have otherwise gone to the child and put them in a trust with a qualified trustee. It's very important who your trustee is, because if you make the wrong payments, you can easily disqualify the child from their SSI and their Medicaid
So
benefits.
the trustee needs to be very knowledgeable about who they
Trustee
can
needs
pay.
to be very, very knowledgeable on how to make those payments, because there are a lot of things they can do. They can pay for recreation, they can pay for entertainment, they can buy cell phones, they can buy cable TV, they can all those things that contribute to the quality of life are what the supplemental needs trust or special needs trust is designed for. The basic needs are taken care of by the government and by public benefit programs.
That's the food and shelter.
Food and shelter, and then the trust takes care of everything else. But you have to make it flexible, because if you don't, you might have a situation where you could actually make what they call an in-kind payment for food or shelter, like put them up in a very nice house. And if you do it properly, it only reduces their SSI benefits by something less than $250 a month.
Wow.
And that's designed for those situations a lot of times where they're living with a relative and they're being fed by the relative. That's also taken into consideration, but to a minimal amount. If you make outright cash distributions to the beneficiary, it's a problem. And as you know, in most cases...
And the beneficiary is the child.
The beneficiary is the child.
The adult child.
The adult child in my case. And then upon the death of the child, it normally goes to another beneficiary, maybe the child's child, maybe other children. And that's the typical kind of trust that we get involved in. And that's actually a bit easier. The more complex type trust is one where someone gets into an automobile accident and they have a very large settlement. And they can also set up a trust for their benefit, but they can't do it. It comes under a set of very special rules.
Okay.
But they can take the large settlement and have it placed into a trust either by their parent, grandparent, or a court.
So in that case, the person that would be established, in our previous case, it was the parents that were establishing the trust for the adult child or for a sibling, say. In this case, it would be the individual that was in the wreck that therefore has the disability would be establishing the trust.
Technically, someone's establishing it for their benefit. They can't establish it under the rules.
That's
a parent or
frightening, isn't it?
child.
Because you would be taking a lot of power away from yourself.
Right. And that's why a lot of them, whenever they have a large settlement, usually the court will actually create the trust for the beneficiary and appoint the trustee and then order that the proceeds go into the trust. In other words, it's all part of the same transaction. The problem with that kind of a trust is if they're entitled to Medicaid, which they usually are, upon their death, if they receive Medicaid from, let's say, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, New York, they actually are required to pay all that money back to Medicaid prior to the other beneficiaries receiving assets.
Wow. So if they have been receiving Medicaid for a long period of time, that could be a substantial amount of money.
It could wipe out the trust at the end in many cases. But that doesn't apply to the case that we normally see, which is the parents who come in. If they're using their own funds, there's no Medicaid payback rule.
Tell me a little bit about the difference between the trustees and the guardians when it comes to special needs trusts.
Well, if you have a guardian, you have someone who can't take care of themselves. In other words, they would be have a mental disability.
And they may or may not be the same person as the trustee?
And in many cases, it will not be the same person as a trustee if a court's involved in setting up the trust. And if you have a guardianship, you have to go through the probate process in order to set it up.
So best case scenario is going to be proactively coming to somebody like you and saying, I have a child with this disability. This is the quality of life that I would like my child to have. This is where geographically I'd like for them to live. This is the person I would like to appoint as guardian, and proactively doing that as opposed to having it, created for them in the court process post-mortem.
Yes, because some of those trusts that I'm talking about that are created for their benefit are cases where they inadvertently inherit money from like a grandparent who doesn't understand that money will disqualify them for the benefit.
And
so it's better to have a trust set up by someone in advance and maybe even have other relatives contribute to that trust, because otherwise you do have the Medicaid payback rules.
And what are those? And that's what you were just talking about, where you would have to...
The Medicaid payback rules basically say that if you've received Medicaid benefits from the state of South Carolina or any state under the Palms, you have to, when the beneficiary dies, you have to pay back the states that contribute Medicaid funds all the way through.
Okay.
And if there's not enough to pay them all, then you have to make a pro rata contribution. And if someone's been on Medicaid for many, many years, there's no money left after you pay that.
Okay.
But the individual's taken care of. It's just that maybe their children or their siblings who would have inherited the money may not receive it.
Okay. Now, I know, I've worked with you before, and I know that you're very, very thorough when it comes to asking people questions during the planning process, during the estate planning process. So what are some factors that you counsel your clients to look for when they're putting together special needs trusts? What are the questions that you ask them?
Well, the first question you ask is, is a special needs trust appropriate? We have had situations where people have just decided, based upon the life expectancy of the individual, the quality of improvement that could be expected, not to do anything.
Really?
Yeah. In other words, there have been disinheritances of individuals because their disability and the government's taking care of it. I mean, if you're in a persistent vegetative state, it's hard to contribute to your quality of life.
Now, can there be springing provisions as well? For example, if you set it up, say, when the child is young and you feel that their development is going to be X, Y, or Z, and then, as they age, their, prognosis improves. Can you have that? But let's say the parent passes away prior to that improvement.
If it's the parents, if it's my funds, like my clients with adult children, they have no obligation to support. Yes, they can do just about anything they want. If it's setting up the benefit with the child's assets, there are many restrictions on what they can do. Many restrictions. That's, again, you go back to the Medicaid payback rules.
And is it irrevocable?
It is if it's set up for. With the assets of the child, like in the lawsuit case.
Okay.
Yes, it has to be irrevocable. Usually they're irrevocable even if they're set up by grandparents.
Okay.
But they don't have to be.
Okay. Now, what about one thing when it comes to estate planning is gifting, to minor children or to grandchildren. What are the rules around gifting to special needs trusts? Let's say, the grandparents establish a special needs trust for a grandchild, which is probably something you commonly see here. What are the rules for gifting to that trust by grandparents?
Well, if the grandparents set up the trust, the rules are very similar to, not having the trust. So well, there's not really anything special that you have to worry about. No, if they set it up, the question is how are they going to fund it? Are they going to fund it when they die? Or are they going to fund it with assets now? There can be gift tax implications to setting up such a trust.
Okay, so the $13,000 that can be contributed.
Yes, and there's a question whether or not you get your annual exclusion with these types of trusts. You may not receive them. Yeah.
That's interesting. You would think that that's a guarantee.
Well, because usually when you make a gift to a trust, you have to have what's called a crummy provision to get the annual exclusion, but a crummy provision is not good for a Medicaid qualifying trust. Keep in mind, most of our trusts are support trusts. They're designed to support the individual. If you draft that trust to support the individual, you will disqualify them from SSI and Medicaid. By definition, you have to make the trust discretionary and give the trustee a tremendous amount of flexibility. Matter of fact, the beneficiary can't really expect any money. It's all in the discretion of the trustee who's out there trying to figure out what payments will benefit that individual. That trustee is the most important part of this equation.
Definitely. That's a real catch-22 when it comes to this kind of planning. How do you counsel people for selecting their trustee? Do you elect corporate trustees, family members? What do you usually counsel?
Most people prefer to have family members, but we have to look at the age of the beneficiary. The question is, will the trustee be alive longer than the beneficiary? But you have to remember, a lot of times with special needs, their life expectancy is not as long as would normally be expected. So you can take that into consideration, and sometimes you're looking at, okay, so you want to name this person. I think they're too old, personally. And then, well, let's have a successor that you trust. And whenever you set these up, they can be expensive to administer. You're into experts, you're into investment advisors. Oftentimes, there's definitely a team when you have a special needs trust, especially if it's a significant amount of money. There are also other types of trusts that people can use called pool trusts for smaller amounts run by charitable organizations. There are about 4 that I know of in South Carolina. And basically with those, you put your money into a pool fund, you have a separate accounts invested collectively.
So less control, but also less expense.
Less control, less expense, and those are used for the smaller amounts.
Interesting.
And in most of those cases, the funds are forfeited to the charity at the end, and therefore you don't have a Medicaid payback rule either.
You might also get a charitable deduction, I suppose, when you contribute the funds to...
Actually, I don't believe you do.
Really?
Really. The charity just happens to be administering it for the benefit of the beneficiary.
Interesting. Well, obviously, there's a lot of dynamics and a lot of details that are involved in special needs trusts. So I expect that people need to seek out an expert team, an expert attorney, to make sure that they cover all the details. And I'm sure they're changing.
They do. It's always important to ask, what the qualifications are of the attorney. In South Carolina, we have specialists in areas like elder law, and we have specialists in estate planning and probate, which is my specialty. And it's always important to know what the qualifications are, and because I would say that most lawyers would not even want to draft a special needs trust. Even if you do trust, there are many lawyers who would prefer not to do a special needs trust because of some of the complexities that are involved.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously, there's a lot of information here that we've covered, and certainly if you have any questions, please contact Michael Howell. His email address and his website are on our screen here below us, beside us somewhere, and we really appreciate your time and your guidance today. So I'll be back in just a minute with a few closing remarks. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome back to Money Matters. I'd like to close with a few parting shots from our show. First, regarding the markets. As I mentioned, we have seen reduced volatility. Volatility itself, the index is down about 20 to 25% as I'm filming right now on Tuesday anyway. One thing that you might consider from a short-term basis, and something that our strategist has been doing for the last couple of days, is shorting the volatility index. If you expect volatility to go down, you might be able to use ETFs to short the volatility index. Again, that's going to be a short-term trade. That's definitely not something a buy and hold investor is going to be looking at, but that is a way to take advantage of what's going on right now market-wise. Another thing to look at, as I said, Home Depot came out with strong earnings, and more importantly, strong earnings forecast. And that is saying that home owners are deleveraging. They're also looking at their homes more as a home as opposed to an investment. There are some macro trends that I know we're considering, our strategist is considering, and something that you might want to look at long term as well. So those are two short-term and long-term trades that you might want to consider. Now, moving on to special needs planning. We were joined by Michael Howell. I'd like to address a couple key points that he mentioned. First and foremost, make sure that you select the right team of experts to assist you in putting together a special needs trust. If you have a child, a family member with special needs, consider establishing a special needs trust and educate yourself. So find the best attorney with experience in special needs planning. Also find an accountant who has experience in the elements, the tax elements of special needs trusts, and also a financial advisor and an insurance specialist. Those are really the four people, the four elements of the team that you're going to need to establish a special needs trust. Of course, also you will have the guardians, the trustees. So look at developing the best, strongest, most experienced team that you can when you're putting together your special needs trust. Also, educate yourself. Educate yourself on what the laws are, what the benefits are that you're trying to preserve. Make sure that you're aware of what those benefits are so that you can maintain those for maximum benefit of your child, of your adult sibling. So that sort of summarizes what Michael told us today, which was extremely informative. If you have other questions, please contact him. His email is available, his website is available. And that pretty much does it for our show today. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found this informative. Please let me know if you have any ideas for subjects that you'd like me to cover, interesting guests. I really welcome your thoughts. Please email me or check us out on Facebook at Money Matters /Polaris. I welcome your ideas. So thank you very much for joining us again this week. I'm Emily Johnson, and this has been Money Matters. Have a great week.